when China wants to suppress certain things in our ecosystem, well, maybe that gets pulled, and you don't know what you see and what you don't on social media platforms. You don't know how your feed's being curated and how the narrative's being shaped. So what starts as getting rid of voices that people really dislike moves along the way to getting rid of voices and ideas that are necessary, that I think most people would agree are necessary to have a functioning democracy. And ultimately, putting those levers of censorship in place will be pulled by people in positions of power, or organizations trying to curry favor with foreign governments where they're trying to get a market share. So that's why, it can start with something like getting rid of QAnon, but where does it end? And that's why most people who are like legal scholars who debate free speech issues will say, well, that's why you can't get rid of something like QAnon, because there is there's kind of no end to it. There's no way to say you can't talk about this thing without a bunch of other things inevitably going with it. Mm-hmm. So usually it ends up harming the very people. Usually, getting rid of free speech protections ends up harming the very people that policy was intended to protect.
Right. Yeah, man. It's
well, that's why we hit that in episode 4, right? Like we go back to Skokie, Illinois, where you have this Jewish attorney defending, someone who's part of who's a Nazi, who wants to demonstrate as a Nazi in Skokie, Illinois, a heavily Jewish community, and a Jewish lawyer took on the case to allow them to demonstrate because he understood this principle at its core, despite it being incredibly emotionally draining for people who were Holocaust survivors, right? And that's the America that I know, because there's an understanding that has to be allowed for the right to actually exist. Because say they had banned, what law can you put in place to ban that kind of speech that wouldn't then be used to silence, I don't know, a civil rights activist in a community where they're incredibly unpopular? Martin Luther King Jr., would they use the same law that says like, okay, well, we now establish that people who are saying things which are disfavored in some way, shape, or form. There's a great book written by Nadine Strawson, who headed the ACLU for I think more than 10 years, called Hate, where she outlines her case of why why it's impossible to legislate against something or create a policy against something like, a Nazi speaking that wouldn't have far-reaching unintended consequences. And they've tried these things in Europe, and the list goes on and on and on of the kinds of speech that gets suppressed, or where people, end up getting arrested or fined or put in jail for saying things that you and I would go, wait a second, that's a perfectly reasonable critique. I'm trying to think of some examples off the top of my head. It's been like a year since I read the book. It's like saying something bad about Christians, for instance. There are countries where that can be sort of inverted, and someone can go to jail for saying something like that. And then what you don't know is the chilling effect that it has. So you don't know when people feel like they can't say certain things, there is self-censorship that kicks in, and then that's when people turn even more to something like the chans. This is, I think, a big part of why it happens in Japan, because people are looking for an outlet to be able to express what they can't socially express. Mm-hmm. So it's a thorny issue, and that's why I think time and time again it gets tested in front of the Supreme Court, because it's always the most vile stuff that tests sort of the limits of free speech. And there are plenty of things that are illegal that you can't do. There's the emergency test. that says, well, if the speech is basically inciting people to commit imminent violence in some way, shape, or form, that is disallowed. You can't yell fire in a crowded theater, right? That's illegal. That's not protected speech. So there is a limit, and this is something that gets tested time and time again. And I do think that one of the big challenges is, well, the internet's global, but does that mean that someone who is in South Africa shouldn't be able to influence policy in America? Because that's what's happening. That's what you see in the series. You got a dude who's managing the Q board who's operating in South Africa, but he's able to write and say things that influence people in America. So in a way, we're exporting free speech around the world, but it means that their speech and foreign actors can influence our way of thinking as well. And that's why I think now we're going into I've seen this from my travels. I had production assistants like in Macau and in South Africa who were like red pilled. They were like a dude in Macau knew who Tucker Carlson was. I'm like, why are you, and was able to cite like all of these characters, like political characters from the United States. And I was like, why in the world would this guy even know who any of these people are? And it's because of things like YouTube, so this sort of, what we're seeing now, I think, is that ideologies are spreading on a global scale. It's borderless. It's super decentralized. And those ideologies are very strongly held. So if there is going to be conflict in the future, and I am doing everything that I can think of to try to avoid that, I really hope that it doesn't come to pass. But if there was another world war, it would be decentralized. It wouldn't be border. It wouldn't be with borders. It would be driven by ideologies where people have come to believe certain things that they've learned through the internet. And QAnon is an expression of that. We've seen it permeate many, many, many other countries. There was recently in Brazil, sort of a failed coup attempt that happened there where they had their own Q shaman. Just a Brazilian version of the Q shaman was there. Japan, they've got 2 different flavors of QAnon there. It's all over the world now. Wow. And they just kind of repackaged it for their own political players, where there's this idea of fighting this evil global cabal. And if that can spread in the form of Q in a global way, then that means that these ideologies are spreading in a borderless way because the internet's borderless. So in a way, American free speech and providing this to the world has opened up free speech to the world, but it means that now on a global scale, we're influencing each other, which is fascinating when you compare that to the Cold War, where it's like we were so afraid of like the communist ideology somehow finding its way into America, and then we had a proxy battle, kind of communism versus capitalism, and now a Russian operative or someone from another country doesn't have to leave their computer to shitpost and influence things. They can do it from the comfort of their own home. So people use the term information war, and it's kind of hard to. Sometimes it's hard to picture that, but it's a battle for people's minds on a global scale right now.